Hello, everybody. Our I can statement today for our math lesson, and this is a little bit of a review from what you did with Mrs. Hall on Friday. I can round to the nearest 100 on the vertical number line. So previously we were learning how to round to the nearest 10 on a vertical number line. We're going to round to the nearest 100 today. So you probably remember this sprint that we did. We're going to get back to that in a minute. You had to find the halfway point, and we started to see some big numbers, and they started to get a little confusing. When we thought about, see down here, finding the halfway point between 10 and 20, that was pretty simple for us. We knew that that was 15. But when we got over here, finding the halfway point between 280 and 290, that threw us off a little bit because those numbers looked bigger. But we're going to do some things on a number line today that will show you how it really is just as simple as finding the halfway point between 10 and 20. So let's warm up, pull out your whiteboard if you haven't already, and we are going to be renaming tens. Now what I want you to do is I want you to write your answer, and then I want you to pause the video as you write your answer. So I'm going to be giving you the answer, but I'm not really going to be pausing. So it's up to you to pause it, write your answer, and then unpause so that you can see if you got the correct answer. So renaming tens, 11 tens equals. Pause the video, write what 11 tens would look like. If you wrote down 110, you are correct. So an easy rule is adding that place value and adding that 0 when it comes to 11 tens or 11 hundreds. Now, 11 tens looks like 110. But let's just say I said, I want you to write 11 hundreds. You would be adding a second place value. This is what 1100 would look like. So with 11 tens, you just add 1 0 because that's how many you would get 110 if you counted by 10 11 times. But if you counted by 100, 100, 200, 300, 400, 11 times, you would end up with 1100 or 1100. So there's two ways to say it. You can say 1100 or you could call this 1100. Let's try it one more time. Okay, so you're going to pause your video after I read this and you're going to write these down. So first we're going to do 19 tens, 20 tens, 28 tens, 30 tens, and 40 tens. So we're not turning things into hundreds just yet. Keep writing them as tens. So if you were to count by 19 10 times, what number would you end up with? Or even easier, how many place values are you going to add? Okay, if you got 190, say the number 190, that would be 19 tens. 20 tens, you should have gotten 200. Say it with me, 200. 28 tens would look like 280. Say it with me, 280. I know I'm getting a little off here, but I can't quite line this up so well with this chunky pen. 30 tens, you should have gotten 300. Say it with me, 300. And then 40 tens, oh, that's supposed to be 30 tens. And then 40 tens, we get 400. Say it with me, 400. All right, let's move on to our application problem. The application problem is asking you to model on the place value chart 10 tens, 10 hundreds, 13 tens, 13 hundreds, 13 tens and 8 ones, 13 hundreds, 8 tens, and 7 ones. So we're going to break this down a little bit. We're going to go over here, and I want you to erase your whiteboard or turn to a new page in your notebook, and I want you to write 3 columns just like this. And you can go ahead and make these 3 columns your 100s, your 10s, and your 1s. Make sure that looks just like mine before you move on. Go ahead and pause so you can make that. Okay, the next thing I want you to do is we are going to put 13 hundreds, 8 tens, and 7 ones in here. So how you're going to go about that is you are going to draw a place value disc, and inside that place value disc, it should have a 100. We need 13 hundreds, 8 tens, and 7 ones. This may take you a second. Make sure you double check that you have 13 hundreds, 7 tens, 8 tens, and 7 ones. Okay, when you're all done, it should look just like this: 13 hundreds, 8 tens, and 7 ones. And what would that look like as a number? Well, 13 hundreds, 8 tens, 7 ones, we're going to write down 13, and those are in, and then that ends up going over into my thousands place. 8 tens, 7 ones. We could read this number as 1,387. We can also read this number as 1,387. So how does this relate to our number line? We're going to round 3-digit numbers to the nearest hundred. So when we're finding midpoints between something like 20 and 30, we know that that's 25. We're finding a midpoint between 40 and 50. We know that that's 45. We've become experts at those last few weeks. But we're going to take the number 387. So let's write that to the side, 387. And we're going to round that to the nearest hundred. Now, instead of deciding, well, what 2 tens is this in between, we need to take this number 387 and say, what are the 200s that this is in between? And how I look at it is I say, okay, what's the lowest 300 can go? Well, 300, 300. That's what we're going to put at the bottom of our number line. Okay, and then the highest it can go, 399, and the next 100 would be 400. So I'm going to put a 400 here on the number line. So the 200s that 387 is in between is 300 and 400. And we need to plot this. Now, when you plot this point, it does not need to be perfect. But 387, first of all, my midpoint needs to be here because this is a 3 tick mark number line. So when we're finding midpoints with between hundreds, we've been talking about how 5 is often that midpoint. 10 and 20, the midpoint's 15, ends in a 5. 20 and 30, the midpoint is 25, ends in a 5. But when we're trying to find the midpoints between hundreds, it's at 50. So my midpoint between 300 and 400 is 350. Oop, there we go. And we have to decide, well, is 387, is it down here between 300 and 350, or is it between 350 and 400? And most of you are probably going to put it right up here, closer to the 400. So that's how we are finding midpoints between these hundreds. Let's try another one. Okay, on your whiteboard, again, make sure that you have this number line drawn. Should have 1, 2, 3 tick marks, one at the bottom, one at the middle, one at the top. Pause the video if you need a second. We're going to find we're going to round 267. We're going to round the number 267 to the nearest 100. So we got to think about, what are the 200s that 267 is in between? Well, if we go all the way to the bottom, the lowest is 200, and the next 100 I would get would be 300. So 200 and 300 are going to be my bottom and my top. And then when we find our midpoint between 200 and 300, just like we were talking about that magic number 5, when we count by 50s, we can find the midpoint: 200, 250, 300. So 250 is going to be my midpoint because 50 is the midpoint between any hundreds. And now it's up to you to plot 267 where you think it should go on this number line. If you think it should go between the 200 and the 500, or the 250 and the 300. I'm going to go ahead and plot it right here, just above the 250. So rounded to the nearest 100, I can conclude that 267 is closer to 300 than it is to 200. All right, and then for good measure, let's do one more independently. So I'm going to give you the number 423. So pause the video, decide what should be at the bottom, what 200s is in between, and what should be at the top, and then what the midpoint is. So you have 4 steps. You have to say, what's the bottom tick mark? What's the top tick mark? What's the midpoint? And then your 4th step, your final step, is to say, okay, 423, where would this be plotted? Which 100 would it be closest to? Pause the video, and then we'll correct our work together. Okay, so your bottom should have been 400, because 423 is between the numbers 400 and 500. And my midpoint is 450. Your 4th step was to plot where 423 would be, and I can see that 423 rounded to the nearest 100, it's going to be a lot closer to 400. All right, let's do this, but this time we are going to do this with 4-digit numbers to the nearest 100. So a 4-digit number, let's just say I have the number 1,342. So I can read this 4-digit number as 1,342, or I can read this number as 1,342. So when I'm rounding this to the nearest 100, I'm not saying what 200s is it, or what 2,000s is it in between. I'm saying what 200s is it in between. So really, this 1,000, this 4th digit right here, we're kind of ignoring that. So if I look at this just as 342, because it still is telling me just to round it to the nearest 100, I know from our previous number line that 342, what 200s is it in between? It's in between 300, it's in between 300 and 400. The only thing that's going to look different is that it's a 4-digit number and there needs to be 1,000 in front of there. So these are between 1,300 and 1,400. My midpoint, again, don't get confused by this 4th digit right here. The midpoint between 300 and 400 we know is 350. The only difference is that I need to remember I have that 1 there because it's still a 4-digit number. So now I need to look at 1,342, and I have to decide, well, is that closer to 1,300 or is that closer to 1,400? Pause the video, see if you can plot this number. Okay, so what I'm hoping is that you plotted this number right underneath 1,350 because it's 1,342. So I can conclude that this is much closer to 1,300 or 1,300. All right, let's do another one. I'm going to use the number 1,275. So let's read this number together. I can read this as 1,275, or I can read this as 1,275. So again, I'm still only rounding to the nearest 100, so I kind of forget about this for a little bit. I do need to include it on my number line, but I can kind of put it out of my head for a second because I know I'm just rounding to the nearest 100, so I'm really just focusing on these 3 digits right here in the ones, the tens, and the hundreds place. So 275, I know the 200s that's between is 200 and 300. And the midpoint between 200 and 300 is 250. But I don't want to forget that I am still working with this 4-digit number, and so I still need that in front. All right. So rounding to the nearest hundred, 275. Pause the video, see if you can plot that point. Just think of it as plotting the hundreds. Don't let that 1,000 throw you off. Okay, I plotted mine right in the middle, right about here. So I can conclude that 275 or 1,275 is a lot closer to 1,300. Okay, for good measure, let's do one independently. I'm going to give you the number 1,489. Okay, so remember, you're rounding this to the nearest hundred. Don't forget about your 4 digits. But remember, we're really just focusing on this part. You have 4 steps. You need to make a bottom to your number line, a top to your number line. So what 2 hundreds? This is in between. You need to make a midpoint, and you need to plot about where this number would be, 1,489. Okay, so it should look like 1,400 on the bottom, 1,500 on the top, 1,450 or 1,450 in the middle. 489, 1,489, that's going to be a lot closer up here. That's going to be a lot closer to 1,500 or 1,500 because I can see that this 89 is well above the 50. All right, now the next point in this lesson is the problem set, which you already did with Mrs. Hull on Friday. But what I'm going to have you do is if you look in your Module 2 packet, I want you to go through and challenge yourself. Maybe look at those, maybe cover up what you did in class and try to do a few of those problems again. Maybe pick 3 or 4 to try to make a number line out of to do again. When we come back, we are going to be jumping into lesson 15. And so we'll be working a little more with rounding and number lines, but I just want to make sure we have some extra practice with these first. All right. Thank you for listening to the lesson. I will talk to you soon.